Well, speaking of elected officials, I spent time in Ferguson, and there's been some polls taken since then that people are not voting. The local people there are not taking advantage of their power to determine what kind of system is there. So I hope the Black Lives Matter or somebody wake those people up and get them to feel valuable enough about themselves to vote for the outcome of their lives.
Well, Lauren, but talk about that, because we've seen a vote within this last year. And some were excited about it, some weren't. What did that election really mean? And in your mind, is it going to remain the same, or what you've seen on the ground serve as potentially something different?
It didn't mean as much as it could, because the right sort of activist candidate hasn't really shown up yet. And it's not enough to tell people to vote and vote and vote and not have the right candidate and the right advocacy behind those issues. Because what we do in this country with black voters is we tell them to vote and just come out and get the, and then nothing changes, because there is no ask and there is no specific candidate of activism on the ballot. So it's not just about the voting, it's who exactly you're voting for. Obviously we got plenty of Democrats in St. Louis that have no problem with what happened with Michael Brown and really had not, said anything. Everybody in St. Louis is a Democrat.
But so in lieu of many of those people not even trusting the system at all.
Right. Where is
the bridge between them not being engaged in the process and there actually being leadership on the ground that, even if they're not elected, helps push
well, they've got that. Black Lives Matter has been really good about stating what their platform is. You just go to their website and read. It's pretty obvious. When your platform is stop shooting black people who are unarmed, I mean, there's nothing about that should be misunderstood. That's why I'm a little bit frustrated, frankly, with the Justice Department, because it's not enough to just put out reports and then take no action, like disbanding the Ferguson Police Department, for example. So, Loretta Lynch doing interviews and Eric Holder doing reports, that's not going to get it. You have to have action backing up these things.
I think that it's a true sentiment, a statement that not a lot has changed in Ferguson. But one thing that I did see that are positive since 1 year later would be the fact that the big box retail stores, Walmarts and the shopping mall and other stores like that remained in the city. That's a good thing. Another good thing is that Church of God in Christ under the leadership of Bishop Charles D. Blake decided to extend their contract for 3 more years in St. Louis, maintaining that. So economically, these economic advancements that are happening there are positives, because what this community needs are opportunities to have jobs, have employment, and things like that. So there has not been a Ferguson effect, which means companies and businesses are not coming into the St. Louis area and leaving.
But that also doesn't transition into those companies investing back in the communities as much as they are having presence and having a commercial power. Tef, I want to bring you in on this, because I think Paris brings up a good point, and that is when you start looking at, because you all have been the most consistent group of anybody on the ground. And so when others are talking about what they have and have not seen, what have you been encouraged by over the course of the last year? And what are you most irritated by that has not moved at all in the last 365 days?
Well, I want to start by pushing back on the idea that the Ferguson front and the Black Lives Matter front are actually one cohesive front. When you go to other cities and you participate in protests, you don't necessarily see a resistance front. What you see in Ferguson is pure Black American resistance towards the state. It's not just people marching and chanting with their hands up. It's an active, strategic interaction between the police and poor people that don't have any other options.
And that's an important distinction. Thank you.
It's a very important distinction. And I also want to state that I want to push back on the narrative that just because people aren't voting doesn't mean that they aren't politicized as well, because in most cases, especially in impoverished communities such as the one like Ferguson, there is a conscientious decision to not partake in the system that produces the same exact results whether you vote or not.
Well, and go a little bit deeper on that, because that was what I was asking.
So we're looking at a terrain where we're typically told to vote for the lesser of two evils or to support the Democratic candidate. Folks have to remember, we've only been at this for 365 days. This problem has been brewing well before that. So what you're dealing with is people finding alternative ways to politicize themselves and to become a political participant within this so-called system. So folks would have different programs. There's a books and breakfast program that my organization runs. There's a tech program that teaches young kids to code, and they build websites for black-owned businesses in order to graduate.
So, but when you talk about the politicizing portion of that and not voting, because I think it's a legitimate strategy, what do you want to see it translate into? Because I don't think anybody can tell you all what your agenda is, but I think a lot of people are curious to know, if you're not voting, what is the strategy and what is the desired outcome?
I think in this community, the not voting represents a will to show a sense of self-reliance. A will to say, you know what, why are we constantly going to these people? You know, we can vote our eyes out, and the president is still going to tear gas us, or still co-sign our tear gas, still call the protesters looters and whatever. So at this point, we've chosen to invest in ourselves. We don't really care about the national narrative of, oh, these young people aren't this, these young people aren't that.
Paris, I want you to chime in a little bit, because I see you shaking your head.
I have some problems with this, because I think not voting is part of the problem. If you don't like the people that are running, that's one thing. Maybe we need to organize in a way to find new leadership and run those people and have you vote for those people, but not voting at all keeps the problem, the status quo, the same, in my opinion.
But Paris, the danger is when we start telling people what their strategy should be. And so, Lauren, I want you to, before we got to get out of here.
Teff is right. We've been voting for years with the same result, and that's because the Democratic Party oftentimes does not represent black people any differently than, particularly on these issues, particularly on race issues, any differently than the Republican Party. That's just the truth. And the only way you scare politicians is saying, look, I'm not coming out and support you time after time. And that's the only way you would scare a lot of these Democrats that really don't care about issues around police brutality.
Doc, real quick, what's the end result, though? Because I think Teff has a good point, but at some point it has to translate into something that's tangible. And he's talking about training, which is taking place, which I think is critical. He's talking about the economic engagement, which I think is critical.
Right.
Are the manifestation of those worth not playing the policy game?
I think Teff and his comrades need to consider having voting as a part of what they do.
All in.
I was in Ferguson, and he's an activist, so he has a perspective that's activist-based. But when I asked people, when I was in Ferguson, I said, how come you black folks are allowing yourselves as a majority to let this small group of white folks run your life? And what I kept hearing is, nobody had answers like his. People were used to powerlessness. They expected powerlessness. They raised their children with the expectancy of powerlessness. And I think that one thing this brother needs to look at is waking up people's perspective on the importance of having power and taking advantage of that, which includes voting as part of their strategy. Because they can create, like the Tea Party, they can find candidates. Exactly. They can create people. They can find dynamic folks and have them to run.
He also made a good point in that this is just 365 days old.
Exactly.
And so, Teff, I want to give you the last word really quickly. Because I think when people look at Ferguson in particular, what is it that you want them to know about the next steps and how they can either support or what they need to be paying attention to, different than what may be going on in Cleveland or in New York or anywhere else?
So I just really believe that Ferguson gives us the opportunity to re-envision what a era of young politicized black folks looks like. And I think also that we have to remember that we're starting with the dirt poor men and women that push back. These aren't academic folks. These are people who work at McDonald's, work at Walmart. I heard someone mention, the jobs, staying in the community. As a person that's lived in North County, St. Louis all my life, I can tell you quite firmly, none of us work there. We won't get hired there. So this when I speak about this self-reliance, we're not saying that voting isn't an option. We're not saying that voting is bad. We're not saying that we don't want to vote. What we're saying is right now, a disruption in the system is occurring, and we are making people look and say, okay, what's really going on? Well, why aren't they voting? When they did vote, who went in and who did what? Who pushed what buttons? What black politicians are actually supporting the quote unquote movement within the local area? So we're looking at the system like, now, okay, you're not going to stand with us. Okay, we have to really plant our own boots, plant our own seeds, and determine what the future looks like for ourselves. And we can talk about voting at a proper time, but I feel like we've been talking about voting since the era of the plantation.
Teff, so thank you so much, brother. I'm sorry I got to cut you off, but I got to go to a break. We took this segment long.